Welcome to the Poster Years. This is a period of graphic design history between about 1900 and 1918. To the Poster Years, this is the early part of the 20th century, from 1900 to about 1918, to the start of the First World War. And in the background, as we talked about before, we've got some fine art movements that are happening that are really earth shattering and world changing in terms of ways of thinking about looking at artwork. Among those, of course, everyone knows about cubism. These are some works by Picasso on the left, the very controversial at the time Duchamp Nude Descending a Staircase in the center, and on the right, a work by one of my favorites, Leger. The cubists were playing with drawing attention to the two-dimensional form of a sheet of paper or a painting, and kind of making the obvious point that paper is not reality, right? A painting is not the real world. And so how do we actually perceive things in the real world? Do we see them in glimpses? Do we see them in sections? Do we see them in three-dimensional form? Do we see them in motion? So the cubists were really having some breakthrough ways of thinking about shape, form, and time. Then we have our friends the futurist on the left, Filippino Marinetti, and on the right, Guillaume Apollinaire. On the left, an Italian futurist. On the right, really more of a French modernist or symbolist. And on the left, that piece is a kind of a story about Marinetti's experience in the war. You can see a journey through mountains, you see a road, you see some explosions, there's some gunshots, and loud noises, and it's the story about journey home from the front. Again, new ways of reacting to the world around us at that time. Another super kooky wacky group of artists. Actually, they were deadly serious. All of these artists, now we might look at them and think, oh, how naive, or what a joke, or I don't know what people think. But at the time, all of these folks were just working really hard to try to understand the time that they were in, which was full of upheaval and change. And in some cases, some of these lap over into World War I, like we talked about with Marinetti and the Futurists. The Futurists were a little kind of pre-Mussolini fascist end of things because they were celebrating the idea of power and war. They were really into speed, machinery, war, and that element was happening all around them. The Dadaists, on the other hand, came from an approach of, it seemed as though the world had gone crazy at some point, and so kind of the Dada position was that everything is absurd. So absurdist is a good word to remember when you think of Dada, and in fact the word Dada they chose as the name of their movement because they felt that it was an absurd word. So you see a lot of interest in the Dadaists. They were interested in things like randomness and chance and disruption and upheaval and meaninglessness. So taking a urinal and signing it, that's Duchamp on the left, and saying, why is this not art? Let's put this in a gallery and see if it's art. Maybe art is anything that's in a gallery. It's kind of a Dada approach. In the center, brilliant artist who called himself John Hartfield. He was actually a German artist and adopted that name because it sounded he was engaged in making protest propaganda really against the Third Reich and against Hitler's party. So this centerpiece is actually the back page of a newspaper they printed, and you were encouraged to rip off the back page of the newspaper and make them into posters. And he was experimenting with very new technology in photo montage, making multiple exposures onto a piece of photographic paper, or printing out photographs and collaging them together to make what, kind of early Photoshop, although it was all done by hand. This image is an anti-Hitler image. He swallows gold and poops out, I don't know, guns, or I forget what the headline is. But anyway, you can see there that the trachea, the digestive system of Hitler, is turned into a stack of gold coins. And on the right, we have an artist named Kurt Schwitters, another German artist who began experimenting with a lot of collage, kind of the idea of things ripped from the headlines. So that's just a cross section, big movement, lots of people doing things. Just kind of reviewing it here. Oh, and then this is my darling. My darling. I just adore her. Sonia Delaunay. She's actually in that photo on the left. And her offshoot movement from futurism was called orphism, and I think of it as orbs because there's all these circle shapes. So really interested in shape and pattern and motion. And she was married to another artist, and he's a little bit maybe was more famous for a hot minute. But as the world turns, people are more and more interested in Sonia. And one of my favorite things about her, I'll show it later. She designed. She was an all-inclusive artist, so in addition to paintings and fine art, she did a lot of fabric design, pattern design. She did some costume design for dada plays, and she designed this amazing car with a matching coat. It was like a 1920s car. I'll dig that up for you. Of course, everyone knows about surrealism, a movement that continues to be popular in its kind of nonsensical juxtaposition kind of way. Again, a reaction to the seeming meaninglessness of the modern world and an investigation into Freud's theories of the subconscious, including dream states and hallucinations, and questioning where do artists' visions come from. They were really trying to be shocking with these images, and I think that's one reason we still like them, is they kind of shock us out of our normal state of life. On the left, a fantastic artist named Max Ernst, who worked in a lot of different mediums but is famous for this book that he printed, that's a series of collaged engravings. So he would find these existing engravings and then make his own engravings and collage things together. So you have these fantastic bird people and other people with animal heads. In the center, Rene Magritte, who painted very realistic situations, but and they're so modern looking in terms of, see, I'm using that word again, in terms of they feel like they could be made yesterday. And in fact, there are a lot of people that are working in this realm photographically, although he was not. That was a realistic painting. That's a photorealistic painting. And on the right, of course, everyone knows our friend Salvador, who captured some imagery from his dreams and his nightmares. And some of them are, I think we like them because they're a little bit scary. They also hark back to even Hieronymus Bosch, who was painting visions of hell in the 1500s. And 1500s? Yeah. Good old Salvador. He was an artist who decided to style himself as a celebrity. He was famous for being famous, and he liked being famous, so he liked to appear even into the 60s and 70s. He liked to appear on television shows. He was on, like, What's My Line, I think, some kind of game show in the 70s, and with his trademark mustache. You saw his GIF on our homepage. Expressionism. These were people who, there's one aspect of modern art that was kind of trying to remove the viewer and their subjective view of the world. We'll talk about that more in in some later movements. But expressionists were saying, when you see, again, when you portray the world realistically, or what the Renaissance would have called realism, you're not getting the full picture because you're not putting the emotion that you actually feel in life into it. So these artists were interested in imbuing their work with something beyond just the subject matter, trying to really communicate an emotion. So on the left, we have a wonderful artist in Germany, Kath Kollwitz, who was expressing some of the dramatic social situations at the time in Germany that was going through horrible inflation and poverty and starvation of the masses. In the center, Henri Matisse, exploring color. The Fauvists were an offshoot of the Expressionists that played with expressive colors. He was a Fauve. And on the right, Kandinsky, who was in more pure abstraction, but also trying to tell the story of his inner life, his inner emotions through color and shape and form. We can't forget that with the invention of photography, there were, as it began to sort of mature as an art form, a number of artists who were playing with photography as fine art and going again beyond the realistic depiction of the world. Of course, photography can be used in a documentary sense of just photographing what is happening every day on the streets and outside of your windows, and there were lots of artists that were doing that. But what I wanted to point out here is a number of people that were trying to use photography as an abstract medium, or as a way to, again, sort of paint with light and not be tied to the world of realistic depiction. So on the left we have Francis Brugier. In the center, a hero of mine, Alvin Langdon Coburn. And on the right, Man Ray. Man Ray, we'll talk about again and again. His birth name I'm going to dub over because it was not Man Ray, and he was born in Philadelphia and he started out painting, he studied with the surrealists, ended up falling in love with photography, did a bunch of experiments called rayograms that are basically photograms, and did all kinds of interesting photo collage, and then moved into being a graphic designer. So that was a real whoosh through all of those modern art movements that were happening in the background. But that is not what we're talking about today. That's all just water under the bridge. What we're going to focus on is how those movements, how all of that new news and all of those experimental approaches influenced what was going on the streets. Or in the Meg's graphic design history book, there's a chapter called Pictorial Modernism, which I think is a nice combination of words. It didn't really enter the vocabulary as the name of a movement until the Meg's book was published in 1984. But it does make sense. This type of design and this period of graphic design was an outgrowth of French and Scottish and really all European poster artists. You might remember from last semester the Art Nouveau movement. So people were already making beautiful art posters that were on the street that were advertising things like oftentimes nightclubs or liquor or a little bit of product advertising. And those were beautiful, amazing posters that often depicted women with curly, flowing locks and organic forms from nature. So that was one aspect of influence, but the other aspect that we're interested in is what I just talked about, all of those new, more abstract, pushing towards the abstract art movements. In addition, there were new communication needs at the turn of the century. So 1900 was different than 1890. Cities were even more crowded. There were new modes of transportation like subways and railways and probably, I don't know, little chugging buses and motor cars coming along. Increasingly industrialized manufactured goods as opposed to craft made or homemade things. So an increasing need for advertising and communication about these products. And overall, a shift from naturalism to a more simplified visual language of sign and shape, trying to communicate things in this busier, more crowded, more fast-paced world. Also probably a more multilingual world as immigration was happening all over Europe. There were a lot of movements between and among cities and social upheaval. So people that were possibly speaking not literate or not speaking one language were looking at these posters, which meant that they had to be simpler and quicker to read. So a simplified visual language of sign and shape. And on top of all of those changes, we also have a new influx in European markets and collectors and galleries of non-European art from Japan and Africa and the Americas. As trade increased with all of those other continents and in the midst of colonialism, we have people extracting valuable artwork from other countries, and making off with it off to Europe, to the museums and galleries of Europe, and selling it for, selling the culture of all of these ancient cultures to white Europeans, but in the process influencing the artists that were working in Europe. Okay, if we diagnose the words pictorial modernism into two words, obviously pictorial, turns out that you can't really make a completely abstract poster and have it communicate what you want to say. It has to maintain some kind of recognizable representational depiction of a subject or story, or at least a symbol that is widely understood. And these are also objects that are increasingly used for less artistic and more commercial or propaganda purposes. So they're no longer trying to just make a piece of fine art. Maybe if you think of like a Toulouse-Lautrec Moulin Rouge poster that now clearly could be displayed in a gallery, in an art museum, or as well as advertising the actual nightlife that was going on. That was a more artistic approach. This is we've moved into a more commercial approach. On the right hand side, modernism, as we take it to mean more simplified, again, symbol like shapes. Elements could be reduced to more nearly abstract, and a continuing investigation by designers and artists of these artistic ideas that the modern movements were pursuing about perception, how we see the world, the flatness of the physical plane of artwork, and acknowledging, no, this is a sheet of paper that's pasted on a wall, or a canvas that's hung on the wall. This is a two-dimensional form. Also, how do we represent motion? How do we represent time in a picture? And how do we communicate a concept or a feeling more than just, a snapshot of life? So if you compare, these are again only a few years apart. We have the Art Nouveau poster on the left by Toulouse, and on the right we have the pictorial modernism version of a poster. And the differences are clear. On the left, we're advertising kind of a concert experience or a nightclub experience. This would be equivalent to like a gig poster or an event flyer. On the right-hand side, we're advertising a product, a manufactured, branded name product, Kasama corn flour. On the left, we've started to get to that flat, plain, very influenced by Japanese prints idea of, here is a woman's face, her hair is flattened to be yellow. Toulouse-Lautrec was using color lithography, so he was drawing on a stone. You still get a little bit of three-dimensional, rendition because he's drawing with a grease pencil on a stone, so it feels very handmade. On the right, the Kasama cornflower poster was made by cutting out shapes and further abstracting them. So it's not like a wildly different world. You can see it's an evolution and not a revolution between the two. But that's how it looks today. At the time, people were like, what's going on? I can't even tell what that is. Is that even a person? What is that? On the right. So a little bit of outrage. More comparisons between Art Nouveau and pictorial modernism. Art Nouveau started out as a fine art movement and then became a craft movement and then became a commercial movement. So if you remember from your historical survey, fine art, Art Nouveau, they were interested in overthrowing the gallery system. They were renegades from art school that were making fine art posters, then moving into things like chairs and houses and the ornamental architectural forms inside of houses, and then on to commercial paint posters. They were still fairly realistic images, even when they were carving Art Nouveau chairs or something. You see those flowing intertwined vines and leaves and hair shapes. And as the Art Nouveau artists went along, they got a little bit more abstracted and simplified, a lot of sinuous curving lines drawn from nature. Very influenced by Japanese prints also. Pictorial modernism, on the other hand, it was commercial from the beginning. So these artists were commissioned from the get-go to make a poster about something. They were thinking in terms of geometric and simplified shapes, and instead of lines, more shape instead of line. In addition, I would say that there is more of an influence from other cultures from the patterns and abstraction in African, Middle Eastern, and the American indigenous art forms. The artists, the fine artists who either transitioned into design or influenced design or dabbled in design, we've got these different movements: the beggar staffs in England, Hoffmann and the secessionists in Vienna, in Switzerland, the sach plakat, the object poster. We have an artist working in Munich, Germany, and then some Americans getting in on the game with post-cubist pictorial modernism. All right, so we'll take these one by one. The Beggarstaff brothers. Also, I'm highlighting in these slides the artist's signatures because you'll see as we go through that they made a habit of signing their posters even though they were for commercial purposes, a tradition that was passed down even to Paul Rand. I haven't seen a lot of people doing that lately, but that was self-promotion by the designer, a really smart way of doing self-promotion. So the beggar staffs were two related individuals, James Pride and William Nicholson. They called themselves the Beggarstaff brothers, but actually they were brothers-in-law. William Nicholson met both Mabel, who was called Pridey, Mabel Pride, and her older brother James in art school, in like an art high school in England. And William Nicholson and Pridey Pride eloped against her parents' wishes, very dramatic, and moved into an old pub, the Eight Bells. I believe this is a picture of the old pub. And her brother, the wife's brother, James, visited them, was friends with them anyway, and ended up staying there kind of in a little artist commune family for almost 2 years. I believe in the background that is William Nicholson holding up his little son and James Pride in the front. That's a picture of the two of them by them. And this was their first collaboration. In their little artist avant-garde group, they had an actor friend who got cast for the lead role in Hamlet. So it was just a little like a regional theater. The actor was Edward Gordon Craig. And this is really one of my favorite objects in all of graphic design. I probably will say that 100 times, but I love the way it walks that line between realistic and abstract. They worked on their initial design partly by collage, and they used the hair and the clothing of the actor, of Edward Gordon Craig. It was accurate to his look. And they cut that out of plain black paper and then pasted it on top of craft paper, what we would call craft paper or brown butcher paper. So a lot of their posters were printed on brown paper. It was cheap. In the printed version used to publicize the play, it was printed life-size. If you can imagine that as a roll of craft paper, you can see how long and skinny it was, probably like 6 feet long. And they stenciled it, so it was really hand printed like one by one, and then they added some details by hand. So just about the most down and dirty version of making a poster. All of these posters are incredibly rare because they didn't print very many of them. If you tried to buy the actual original, if there were even, some of them don't even exist anymore. They're working from like images of the original. But if you could get your hands on an original Cassima Flower poster, it would be, I'm going to say, over $100,000 for this poster. So this is a poster for a Scottish flower company in 1894. This is one of their first posters that has a traced version of it that survives. So I think it was the outline. They cut it out of collage and then they traced it, and the tracing part is the only thing that survives. They were, they considered themselves respected academic painters. They opened this little advertising studio together in 1894, and they called themselves the Beggarstaff Brothers to protect their reputations as artists, which is kind of interesting. There's still persists to this day a kind of tension between fine artists and graphic designers, even though lots and lots of people from both ends of the spectrum cross over. There definitely used to be a taint of commercialism, like that you were selling out to make a buck, or in the case of the Beggarstaff brothers, I guess you were selling out to make an English pound. As they gained reputation, again, their So they were commissioned to do a poster for Harper's Magazine. You can tell, I think, on here, which part of this poster did they not do. If you guessed the right hand side, the typography, you are correct. But the left hand side is masterful. The way that the image is made out of the background color with no real edges showing, and the way that your brain sort of supplies that dimension. They moved around and changed and cut altered pieces of paper to come up with this perfect shape. And this was a more collectible fine art piece they did. They started to be able, they were like, hey, if we're making these posters to sell other people's stuff, can't we just make some posters to sell our own stuff? Can't we just sell some posters for people to put in their living room and, try to make some money off of prints? So they did a few of these. This is called Girl Reading on a Sofa. And there was all kinds of chatter, if there would have been a Twitter back then, there would have been chatter on Twitter, but there wasn't. So the chatter took the form of reviews in the newspaper or articles in fine art magazines. And one quote said, "So infectious has the doctrine of the silhouette become that it almost begs the question if it has not reached the point of decadence." So, and what I take that to mean is, how far can we go? Like, is this girl too abstract? It almost feels like a Matisse cutout or something to me. Okay, another ad for Roundtree's Cocoa in 1897. Apparently there was a lot of back and forth with the clients, but they were eventually satisfied and they ended up using this ad for years and years. It still sort of seems as offhand as a little sketch, but it was actually carefully thought out. One of their more fully resolved masterpieces, this is from 1896, and sadly, in the end, the client, the producer of the play, of the theatrical production, didn't like it, so it didn't get used. But luckily, they preserved, again, the tracing of it. If you think about this versus one of those Art Nouveau posters, like put this in your mind against the Job cigarette poster, or some of those super curly whirly French and Italian posters that were going on, this would have just looked like, what? So overly, deceptively simple, I would say. Yes, there are a few lines, there are a few colors, everything is absolutely flat, and yet it's really evocative of the play. The producer of the play, Sir Irving, thought that it was a bad likeness, and that's why it didn't get used. Their style was so novel that it became known as the English style, and it was published a lot. There was a graphic magazine called The Studio, and The Studio was a very influential piece of media, I guess, at the time, because it traveled across international lines. Information did not travel nearly as quickly as it does today, and yet the influence of artists still influenced each other. So this, their work was seen, and crossed influences are evident. This is a French artist, Bonnard. This is a screen, and even Toulouse-Lautrec, the Beggarstaffs communicated, wrote letters back and forth. They were mutually influential to each other. So that's the Beggarstaffs. That's going on over there in England. In Germany, in the meantime, we have Plakatstil. This was the German poster style. The style emerged in Germany around 1905. Again, there was clear influence. People were reading each other's, studio magazines, and so they could have been influenced by the English and French, probably definitely French Art Nouveau. And hallmarks of this style are bold lettering, a very simple central image, and again, flat, eye-catching colors. You know what I mean by flat colors, right? Flat colors meaning there's no gradation within the color. It is red, the same consistency from edge to edge. It's what you would get if you filled a shape in Illustrator, or if you painted with a brush in Photoshop with just one color, or if you cut out a piece of paper. So no tone, no gradation, no source of light. The major man in the Plakatstil we're going to talk about is Lucien Bernard. There's his trademark signature. You can see he's gone a little bit farther in terms of making his signature into a logo. And that's him. in perspective. I like finding these artist portraits that were taken by other artists. He had an adopted name. He was born Emil Khan. Okay, so there's not very much known about his early life, but it's known that his family did not support his creative and artistic desires. He attended an art school in Munich. That's where he witnessed many works of the artists of the Art Nouveau period. And in 1903, he moved on his own to Berlin, where he changed his name, became Lucien Bernard, maybe because his father disowned him. We're not sure. There's an apocryphal story. While he was in Berlin, he entered a poster competition for Priester matches. And this is one of those stories that maybe is a little bit whispered down the alley, but elements of it are certainly true. He entered this competition, and at the time, remember, there was no such profession as graphic design. So if there was a poster competition, probably like everybody entered, and it was more like an art competition. And again, Art Nouveau was all the rage, so we can only imagine that with Priester matches, if you think about the Job silhouette cigarette paper, I'm sure there was a lot of curling smoke and flowing locks and ladies smoking cigs and flame-shaped shapes. And he apparently originally drew a smoking cigar next to an ashtray with matches on a checkered print tablecloth. And then somebody was visiting him, and then they started talking about, well, maybe that looks too much like a cigar ad and not a match ad. So he painted out the cigar, and then he painted out the table, and then he painted out the ashtray, and all he was left with was the matches. And the irony of the story is that the image was thrown away, but a judge found it, and Bernard ended up winning the competition. This was the start of what they call the sach plakat style, the object poster, and also the start of his extremely successful career. And it's kind of interesting because much like the musician who has a big hit in one genre, it was working for Mr. Bernard, and so he just stuck with it, although he did refine the technique a lot by the time he got onto these excellent shoes, which I completely want to wear, in 1912. This is 9 years later, still same idea, object, name, boom. And yet, much more sophisticated in terms of the representation of the object. It's getting a little bit more realistic. There's, suggestions of light and depth, but even the shadow, it's not a gradated shadow, it's an abstracted shadow. It's what I would call high contrast. And this is him. This is probably 1918 or 1919. Getting a little more realistic, and maybe that's because it's an ad for a pencil, which after all does have tone and does have gradation, and you can see the little wood grain in the end of the pencil. So a Faber-Castell, still the artist's favorite, but object, word, signature, done. Object, word, signature, done. I love this one so much. What a great color palette. So great. All right, and you can see he was a really sophisticated type designer as well. You've got this kind of signature from the ages, like wobbly edge, probably because he was painting these with a brush. And you can see that in here too. This is from the Berthold Type Foundry. This is a typeface that he designed in 1910, and it was based on poster lettering that was created by Bernard. So you can feel this chunky. For one thing, it's kind of chunky. For another thing, it's a sans serif typeface. It's very modern for 1910. He was not a one-dimensional guy. This is a logo for Hummel micrometers. They were measuring devices. This is made in 1912, and it's such a cute little man. Every shape and form inside of the figure is one of the products, and the figure is holding a micrometer, one of their sensitive measuring devices. Another cigarette ad. This is cool because in addition to designing the poster, right inside of the poster he's featuring his branding. He designed a logo for these cigarettes, pretty super simple, and if it reminds you of the Lucky Strike cigarette packages, that's because they probably were following right along in his footsteps. This is the trademark for Mandel cigarettes from 1910, an emphasis on reduction, minimalist form, and simplification that even anticipated the later constructivist movement, which is in the next chapter. slash lecture. Another German artist, Hans Rudi Ert. Very similar style. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between these two. This is a poster for Opel Automobiles in 1911. So this artist, Ert, definitely was applying the Beggerstaff and Bernard formula of a flat background color, a large simple image, and a product name, but his figures I think veered a little bit more to the Beggerstaff. He was interested in human figures and a little bit more detail. He's got more color runs. We'll see some more of his work later. Ludwig Holbein, also, the thing that separates him from his contemporaries, this was done in 1908, is this interesting use of not only continuing that background into the figure, but filling it sometimes with pattern. This is just, I can't look at this without thinking of it as an Illustrator file. Oh, like, you could just draw that shape and then fill it with a pattern. Boom. But he was not doing that. He was painting it. And this is an example of this applied texture and decorative pattern in the shapes of his images. And maybe it was done also, maybe it was composed using cutout paper. This is from a bit later. This is the 1920s, and many of these artists, if they made it through World War I, continued with the post-World War rise of German industry. There was a sudden upswing of clients available, including Audi, BMW, Daimler-Benz, Lufthansa, Marklin, Mann, and Henkel. All of those brands, which still exist today, grew between World War I and World War II. And in the United States, some of the artists received commissions for Camel and Fatima cigarettes. Love this. This is 1919. This is Holbein again, Ludwig Holbein, a poster for the International Import Fair. That's what the event was. And so we see this awesome distorted perspective of a steam locomotive and packages falling from all over, or flag spilling out of this train. And I love the fact that the smoke is done with some kind of letterpress roller effect. Maybe that's because I'm a letterpress printer, but it's got that transparency of ink applied on top of other ink. This is another poster by Holbein. Nice subtle background going on. You can see also, again, notice his little branding. If you go back to the choo-choo train picture, he's got a little thing going on in the corner. He's playing with it, evolving it into this little square. Okay, now we're going over to Switzerland. Switzerland and sach plakat, the Swiss object poster style. So sach plakat, the literal translation from German, is object poster. These posters were influenced by cubism and constructivism, but they still needed to maintain a pictorial reference to communicate something to the general public. This dominated style. You'll see it grew. It got a little bit, it hovered over the lines between abstract and realistic as it grew and changed and morphed from the 1920s through the 1950s. Big news, big deal, very trendy in Switzerland from the 20s through the 50s. And it's kind of interesting now. It seems like, everybody knows about these posters. Everybody knows about Holbein and the Beggerstaffs and blah, blah, blah. Not really. All of this little weird moment in time between Art Nouveau and between the constructivists and the Stil people that we're going to learn about next time, all of this was pretty obscure in the world of graphic design before there was the academic subject of graphic design history. All of these artists were, they were big during their time, but then they kind of passed on through and were overlooked, which is typical, I think, of people that produce ephemeral artwork pieces, meaning things that come and go, things like matchbooks and posters and brochures and newspapers, until they were recognized as, cultural artifacts and preserved, were generally just made and thrown away. So no one really, even though you might have walked down the street and gone, that's a cool poster, no one would have thought of preserving it, hanging it on the wall, making it into a gallery poster, or selling it hanging in your home, until they were kind of brought back from the dead. So a lot of these originals are missing or are extremely rare. This poster is very famous. It's an example of the first modern Swiss poster design. This is a picture of the Matterhorn, which is a mountaintop in the city of Zermatt, Switzerland. Schweiz means Switzerland. This was a travel poster to get you to want to hike up there to the top of the Matterhorn. In Switzerland, if you don't know, has three principal languages, so posters needed to be very visual with minimal copy so that they could be understood by everyone. Also, they were kind of a blend between German, French, and Italian culture. So we've got the influence of German plakat posters and French and Italian Art Nouveau blending. This is much later. This is 1941 by an artist named Nicholas Stocklin. So this abstracted face is an ad for sunscreen, sunblock. It's one of the most celebrated posters of the object poster style. Different interpretation. This is the same artist, Nicholas Stocklin, much earlier in 1922, his first masterpiece done in that style, and it's kind of an insider topic. It's about letterpress printing. It's an exhibit of letterpress artwork. It's got more text than a typical object poster. It nevertheless has that single-minded focus of look at this object that tells the story. Herbert Lupin, 1949. He's been called the most successful poster artist of all time because he's made more than 500 commercial posters. This was for a newspaper called the Weltwoche. A number of artists worked for the men's clothing company PKZ. This poster is by Peter Burkhauser. It does not get much more simple when you're talking about an item of clothing than to show a button. By him also, this is from 1951. For tuxedo manufacturer. The name of the suit manufacturer was Durable. Something creepy about that. Along came the next movement that fits in this category of, again, we're talking about pictorial modernism in posters, is Art Deco. Simplification and abstraction were the hallmarks of Art Deco, but it did evolve out of Art Nouveau, so we've got a little leftover sort of graceful elegance and exoticism at the beginning especially, that got kind of more and more machine-like and muscular and forceful as we moved later into the 1920s and 30s. So this is the poster for that show, the Exposition of International Decorative Arts in Industry in 1925, and what elements you can see here are again it's like, wow, factories making stuff, what? And they have big black plumes of polluting smoke. Yes, modernism is here. And that polluting smoke seems to have formed into a rose-shaped cloud in sort of a beautiful way. So we've got, and the factory in the background is, a series of squares and triangles and dots, and the rose is just some sort of a suggestions of a rose shape. How do we define Art Deco? Well, it was after the Cubist movement. You can see looking in there some echoes of our friends Picasso and Braque and the Cubists. So after the Cubists, 1920s, influenced by Cubism heavily. Some of the favorite motifs of Art Deco are streamlining, meaning curved shapes, zigzag, and decorative geometry. Geometric shapes like triangles, especially triangles, anything zigzaggy, that express the modern era of the machine, a real tribute to machine-age living. It satisfied Art Nouveau's passion for decoration, so there was still, repeated patterns, a lot of, elaborate sort of decoration. It wasn't completely simplified, but popularized by a bunch of different expositions, publications, and schools, and again, absorbing some influence from colonialized places like Egypt and the Americas. Also, this is one of many movements that expanded beyond graphic design into obviously things like clothing, furniture design, architecture, rugs, all kinds of design. This is a poster for the Daily Herald, which was an English newspaper in London. The artist is E. McKnight Coffer, an important name to remember. It's a little bit wonky with it. I feel like the type kind of ruins it again, but if you look at those crazy flight of birds, is it a flock of birds? Is it a flock of airplanes? Why do birds have something to do with news? I guess because they fly to you and, a little bird told you the latest thing, the word on the street. So it's really a pretty abstracted symbol for news. It's not like that newspaper exclamation mark that we saw. But you can see here how cubism and futurism are combined. That Leger poster, those futurist type experiments, very geometric, very abstract. And I feel like some copywriter came along and said, "We've got to add some copy. Soaring to success. Wah, wah, wah. The early bird. Wah, wah, wah." The same artist, E. McKnight Coffer, did a bunch of the wonderful London Transport posters. When you look at the London Transport resource, you're going to see a bunch of his work. This is from 1930, and look how reductive that landscape is. It's very much it almost feels like a Cezanne or a Kandinsky painting. It's almost not even that recognizable as a place, but they're enticing us to come to different destinations in Europe and using the techniques of modern art. In France, the master of Art Deco, a name that you should definitely be able to pull out of your pocket in any kind of intelligent conversation. Just drop in the words Cassandra or Cassandra if you're really going to be French. A.M. Cassandra. This is a poster for the Paris newspaper in 1925. Very, again, two-dimensional, simplified. And the woman in the background, the female face, is a very abstracted representation of the character Marianne, who represented France. So in this case, we have Marianne all wired up to a telegraph. So this newspaper received its information by telegraph, super high tech, and was able to then broadcast the latest news out to people. I think she looks a little bit panicked, like her ears being electrocuted somehow. And we've got, the hallmarks of Art Deco here. What's going on? We've got diagonal lines. We've got a lot of motion implied. It feels like, a railroad or a road going to the vanishing point inside of her ear. We've got geometric shapes. She's completely made out of circles and squares and diagonals. We've got this bold sans serif lettering. We've got the name of the product is cropped off. You go try presenting that to the client. We're just going to use half of your name. People will figure it out. We're going to use the newspaper's letterhead, but not show the whole thing. Okay. So cool. Another famous Cassandra poster for the North Star, which was a Paris to Amsterdam night train. Swooping perspective again, broad, simple planes of color. And you've got this kind of distinctively Art Deco. Well, first of all, the sans serif type with the overlapping letters at the bottom is very Art Deco. The letters in the type are even made out of circles, squares, and triangles. One of the most famous posters probably of all time. For a while there, and I feel like in the 1970s, maybe it's back again, it was showing up in every coffee house that you went to, every cafe, every travel poster would try to imitate this feeling. And one of the cool things about it is that, the contrast between this little tiny tugboat and this gigantic steamer, and the steamship itself was, of course, a new means of travel. And the way that there is a square within a square, that they have found the square that reveals the shape of that massive steamship. There's something about that just works so strongly as a poster. Does that cubist thing of playing with, is this a three-dimensional space? No, it's a two-dimensional space. Is it a collage? No, it's just a painting. It's just a piece of paper. Is it the real thing? No, it's not the real thing. It's very cubist. This is 1931. Another icon of advertising by the artist Cassandra. These posters were sometimes displayed 1, 2, 3 all at the same time, but ideally it would have been papered over, with first the one on the left where the man's contemplating the drink, then the one in the middle papered over the top where he's drinking it, and then the one on the right, the finish. So it's almost like a little animated GIF or a little piece of film. And the wonderful thing about it, it's a pun in French. Dubo means doubt. He's looking at the glass like, huh. And then dubon means of some good, it means a little bit good. And then dubonnet is the name of the product. So, and also the way that the product fills the man up, like an old advertising promise. It's like becoming more complete with the consumption of this alcoholic drink. Cassandra was not only a wonderful and imaginative graphic designer and advertising art director, also designed a bunch of typefaces, sometimes within the service of a poster, and then he would extricate them. And again, a foundry would work on developing them into a full, complete font. This is called Bifur, Bifur. It was designed in 1929. The strokes from the letter are omitted, restored to the basic shape by just that linear second color, whether it's a series of diagonal lines or the color yellow. Peignot. Peignot was the name of the foundry and the name of the owner of the foundry. You've got a thick, thin sans serif that almost walks the line. They would call this a humanist sans serif or an expressive sans serif. He also was interested, as were a number of artists at this time, in making a universal alphabet. And this is another artist, Paul Colin, travel poster for Paris in 1935. I threw this in there because it's so cubist, or it's very Kandinsky-ish to me too, very expressionist. Another piece, the English artist Austin Cooper, a poster for the Southern Railway from London to Paris, extremely cubist. Same artist, Austin Cooper, a poster for the London Underground in 1924, and he did this set of two. It's warmer down below for the wintertime, and it's cooler down below for the summertime. Somebody stumbled across the fact, underground it's the same temperature year round. So he used this pure integration of color and shape to solve a commercial design problem. And our dear boy Man Ray from Philadelphia was commissioned to do a poster for the London Underground. And he's combined a three-dimensional view of the new logo for the London Underground up at the top with the planet Saturn. I don't know. Does Saturn keep going? I don't know, but it just feels like, ooh, I don't know, new age. Man Ray again, by underground to fresh air. I don't know, can we go to outer space on the underground? I don't really understand. Joseph Binder, a poster for the Vienna Music and Theater Festival from 1924. I'm just throwing in a lot of things at the end here that are just super, super cubisty looking to reinforce my point. Why is this called postmodernist expressionism? Because we are imitating those modern artists. They are heavily influencing the design. A poster by Schultz Nudam, that's a hyphenated last name, cinematic poster for the movie Metropolis in 1926. This Art Deco mindset also often conveys a kind of utopian optimism about the future. I would say that Metropolis, on the other hand, this movie that this is an advertisement for by Fritz Lang, you ought to watch it if you have not seen it, is a definitely dystopian view where robots replace people, something that we should be worrying about right now. The robots that replace us probably will not be as cool and well designed as these Art Deco robots in the movie, but and in the poster. But just to reiterate that this style, this post-cubist pictorial expressionist style, also traveled internationally. This is a sticker for the Semiramis Hotel in Cairo and printed in Egypt. Probably some kind of expatriate European, I don't know, or an Egyptian that was influenced by the modern art. Again, an unknown artist for the Hotel Crillon in La Paz, Bolivia. So with those steamships and railroads and magazines about art, styles could travel all around the world. This is a poster in Russia in 1920, showing a little bit of that Beggarstaff influence. You got that red flatness going on in the background and some reduced shapes. It's not completely Art Deco-y, but it's in the neighborhood. Okay, with that, that's the poster years. Super influential time in graphic design. Think about how that flat shape idea still translates. Again, it's very easy to do in Illustrator and Photoshop, and it's around us everywhere. You're going to see it all over your daily life now. So enjoy. I hope you like this. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Catch you on the flip side. Bye.